Since the start of the pandemic, Europeans have protested lockdown measures against COVID-19. Ostensibly, the root cause of these protests is only the lockdown measures. But upon further examination, some of the protests in Europe since lockdown have contained elements of previously existing economic issues, Euroscepticism, and far-right sociocultural issues. Our group's research has focused on examining these protests and understanding them within their greater context to best determine what factors have caused Europeans to take to the streets.
Frustrated protesters in London march against COVID-related restrictions. In Glasgow, bar and restaurant workers dump ice on the street outside city chambers in protest. Anti-mask protesters in Dublin say they are sick of being told what to do.
I'd like go to mass, I'd like go to a funeral, put masks on everywhere we go.
This is justly unfair and it's a crime against humanity and shame on the government of Ireland.
And in Rome, citizens push back against government measures to curb the spread of the virus, despite daily case numbers in Italy spiking this weekend to levels not seen since late March, when the country was in lockdown. Across Europe, many citizens are craving a complete return to normalcy, even though the numbers paint an alarming picture. England is at a tipping point, says its Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And on Monday, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to announce further steps to control the spread of the virus. Over the weekend, France set a record with over 26,000 new cases in 24 hours on Saturday. As cases are on the rise, so is frustration as governments across the continent are responding. Restrictions on nightlife in Berlin have left business owners agitated.
Because of this measure, the world is watching Berlin. I don't understand how the mayor can destroy the largest economic sector of his city. It's unbelievable.
But the German leaders continue to stress the importance of those restrictions.
I once again make an urgent appeal to the 20 through 40-year-old community in big cities to understand that this is not a time for partying, not a time for negligence, but it is a time to protect others, especially the elderly, and prevent the number of infections from exploding.
For now, people continue living within confines, desperate to go back to the life they once knew. Isa Suarez, CNN.
The United Kingdom has seen several protests in response to COVID-19 measures, including protests where Piers Corbyn, the brother of Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, spoke declaring the virus a hoax. Protests have included several conspiracies involving the anti-vax movement and the assertion that lockdown is a method of social control. In September, a large protest dubbed the We Do Not Consent rally took place in which citizens protested what they viewed as authoritarian infringements on human rights by the government and its COVID restrictions. The United Kingdom demonstrates some very clear links to the anti-vax conspiracy theory and lockdown protests. It is also significant as much of the rhetoric used is in reference to human rights and freedoms, rather than rhetoric about loss of economic prosperity as we see in other countries. The majority of protests in France have been centered around Marseille and Paris, with the odd case of a Michelin star-winning chef leading protests in the town of Bordeaux. Protests in Paris have included existing members of the Yellow Vest movement, as well as general protests against COVID measures, protests for better pay and benefits for healthcare workers, and general strikes by healthcare workers. In Marseille, however, the protests have been helmed by restaurant workers and owners who feel personally grievanced by the stringent restrictions on the city, especially when compared to other regions. Groups such as Amnesty International have criticized the country's harsh laws on peaceful protest in the wake of COVID, stating that France's mask ban from 2019 was incompatible with the masks necessary for peaceful protesting while socially distanced. Protests in France are notable for a variety of reasons. First, the French tradition of protest explains the greater amounts of protests even without clear political ideologies within France, compared to other countries, as well as the extreme measures taken by the French government to limit protesting. The Yellow Vest movement's continued protests demonstrate the salience of Eurosceptic and anti-neoliberal sentiment among protesters in France throughout the COVID crisis. On August 30th, mostly peaceful protesters took to the streets in Berlin. Many were protesting against perceived human rights violations, but the protest also included contingents from the German far right, including a group, Querdenken 711, which argues that COVID is a hoax. The protest also received support from Robert F. Kennedy, a known anti-vaxxer who spoke and attended at the protest. Numerous supporters of the extremist conspiracy theory QAnon attended the protest as well. The QAnon conspiracy believes that there is a sinister cabal of satanic pedophiles controlling world affairs and that Donald Trump is fighting them in a shadow war. Between the beginning of the explosion of COVID in March and June, QAnon-related posts increased 175% on Facebook, with similar increases across Instagram and Twitter. This has resulted in an export of QAnon to Europe. It is particularly popular with the German Reichsbürger far-right group. The presence of anti-lockdown protests in Germany is significant, as the Merkel government has the highest approval rating of any state since the COVID outbreak, even as the country has had some of the most stringent measures against COVID, meaning that the protests are in a significant minority of Germans that has included fringe groups focused on anti-vax conspiracies and far-right socio-cultural issues in Germany. In Greece, artists protest the tightening of restrictions in Athens, their capital. The restrictions only allowed a maximum of 9 people to gather in public or indoor spaces from September 21st to October 4th. This meant that concerts and live music were banned. Because of this, artists were struggling to find employment and wanted the government to ease these restrictions. Another demonstration occurred in Greece where students marched against the government's herd immunity policy. They realized that many students, doctors, and transport workers were getting the virus and urged the government to keep schools closed. Many students joined a movement to occupy schools that reopened in the fall. By the 24th of September, they managed to occupy over 200 schools in Greece. These examples in Greece are significant because they show one of the rare examples of a pro-lockdown protest. This is also combined with the unique Greek protest culture, which, much like French protest culture, has normalized protests and even riots in the face of political grievances. These protests appear to have been driven primarily by COVID measures rather than outside forces and are exacerbated by the Greek culture of acceptable protest. In Belgium, in early September, around 350 people protested against the government's measures to control the pandemic. They were given several warnings by the police for breaking social distancing guidelines and for not wearing masks, but the protesters refused to leave. 2 were arrested and many more were fined. In the image on this slide, a protester is holding a sign with the acronym WWG1WGA. This acronym is associated with the QAnon movement and stands for Where We Go One, We Go All. The protests in Belgium are significant, as although Belgium has had the highest death rate in Europe, members of the far right are still protesting lockdown. The protests provide greater evidence for the associations between anti-lockdown measures and QAnon-related far-right groups. Protests broke out in Serbia on July 7th following the president's announcement of new curfew measures. The protests were met with force by riot police who dispersed tear gas as the protesters stormed the capital. International media quickly characterized the protest as anti-lockdown, but in truth, the public was outraged by President Aleksandar Vučić's lifting of the original lockdown weeks before the country's parliamentary elections, in order to portray victory over COVID and position himself well before the elections. Political animosity towards Vučić's government has been stewing for years. His switch to a pro-EU stance after 12 years in opposition, his privatization and austerity measures in response to IMF loans, and the perception of selling out to the EU have garnered massive animosity from the general public. This was compounded after Vučić's party won an election that was widely described as undemocratic, although readily accepted by the EU. Once his party won the election, Vučić reversed his stance on anti-lockdown measures and began new curfews. The perceived hypocrisy combined with other unpopular stances by Vučić has resulted in subsequent protests. This protest is significant because it shows how COVID can be a catalyst for the existing issues of corruption, Euroscepticism, and democratic erosion. In Dublin, up to 2,000 people marched through the city centre on September 12th to protest wearing face masks. This march was started by Yellow Vest Ireland, which is a group that describes themselves as a people's movement and claims that they are not aligned with any specific political groups. However, they do have associations with chemtrail conspiracy theories, fluoride conspiracy theories, and have declared climate change a hoax. There were no arrests, and it was a peaceful demonstration, although the group did have encounters with counter-protesters displaying anti-fascist banners. These protests further demonstrate associations with the anti-COVID measure protests and the European far right. In Czechia, Czechs protest against quarantine and mask policies. About 400 people gathered in Prague and opposed the rule which requires everyone to wear a mask, indoors and in public spaces. The protest was peaceful, and while protesters didn't keep social distance, they didn't require controls from authorities. In October, however, protests grew violent in Prague as protesters took to the streets to protest restrictions on gatherings, despite Czechia's record number of infections in recent weeks. The protest violence resulted in an estimated 20 people getting injured. These protests seemed isolated to COVID-19 and are less indicative of larger political trends in Czechia. In the Netherlands, in June, police detained 400 people, most of whom were members of the hooligan scene. A large number of those detained were released. However, thousands of protesters congregated around the Dutch seat of government, despite the rally's banning. The Dutch police detained protesters who refused to disperse. The Hague's mayor confirmed the rally was banned because of allegations that notorious troublemakers would be attending, in particular, some of Netherlands' famous football hooligans. On October 17th, a group of protesters outside the stadium of FC Den Bosch also received coverage because one of the members allegedly shouted Heil Hitler during the protest. However, it is unknown whether this group was explicitly hooligans. Protests in the Netherlands further demonstrate the propensity for groups with a long history of civil disobedience or rowdy behavior to engage in protests, whether COVID lockdown is present or not, as well as associations between extreme right ideologies and young sports fanatics. Spain, a country with one of the highest infection rates in Europe since July, has had a culture war component to its protests from both the right and the left, centered around the capital city of Madrid. In September, the city saw widespread protests against localized lockdown measures instigated in the lower-class district of Vallecas. Protesters criticized the failures in the healthcare system, as well as a class-based lockdown system. As the virus worsened in Madrid, the socialist state government imposed a state of emergency within the city and implemented citywide COVID restrictions. The center-right government protested the measures as unnecessary and draconian. Spain's protests are notable because they show the left-wing class considerations that have been absent in protests in other European nations, which have typically had a right-wing bent to their protests. Additionally, it shows the bureaucratic tension between the state and local governments regarding COVID. To conclude, anti-COVID measure protests rarely exist in a political vacuum. They are often symptomatic of other issues, as in the case of Spain and Serbia, or effects of a normalized protest culture such as in France and Greece. Class and culture war, Euroscepticism, and corruption have been exacerbated by lockdown like a social pressure cooker, further influencing protests. Additionally, conspiracies about COVID have become fully integrated into the ideology of far-right groups, as demonstrated by QAnon and far-right protests in Belgium and Germany, as well as in Ireland. When we talk about protests against COVID restrictions, it is imperative that we take these considerations into account to paint an accurate representation of the public's opinion on lockdown measures in Europe.